In Harvest's End, things didn't rot. A fallen deer in the woods or an apple dropped in the orchard would not bloat, soften, or feed worms. It would simply wait, skin tightening over bone, flesh preserving in the air that tasted of iron and damp cellars. The soil, it seemed, was a pantry, fiercely territorial. The people were the same, moving with a dreadful, unhurried patience, gardeners not of crops, but of circumstance. They mended the one road leading into the valley, but never the potholes leading out. They polished the iron hooks on their porches until they gleamed, practicing smiles in cracked mirrors, stretching them wide to hide the calculations behind their eyes. They were all waiting. The preserved deer, the patient townsfolk, the hollow, eyeless figure, lashed to a crucifix of timber in the central field. Waiting for a sound, not the wind, not the crows, not the creaking of their ancient houses. Then, miles away, a hopeful, unfamiliar sound breached the ridge. The hum of a family SUV. A tremor, too deep for an earthquake, passed through the valley. A collective, silent breath was drawn by every living thing. The table was set. The guest of honor was arriving. The first sound was the rhythmic tick-tock of the SUV's turn signal, a small mechanical heartbeat against the immense silence, a sound of order, of intention. For David Miller, it was the sound of a promise kept. His hands held the leather-wrapped steering wheel at a perfect 10-2, the grip firm but not strangling, a practiced, methodical hold. His cool, steady grey eyes completed their circuit for the 12th time, speedometer pinned precisely at 40. Gas gauge comfortably over halfway. Rearview mirror. In the mirror's small rectangle, David saw the reason for it all. Sarah, his wife, had her head leaned against the passenger window, the tense lines around her mouth finely smoothed by the hypnotic blur of passing trees, a real, soft smile playing on her lips. Behind her, 8-year-old Lily was lost in a world of illustrated dragons, small pink sneakers kicking rhythmically against the back of her mother's seat. This was the data point that mattered, this quiet, contained peace. A weathered wooden sign emerged from behind skeletal birch trees. Welcome to Harvest's End, Pop 312. The green paint flaked, revealing silvered wood. Rust bled from bolts holding it fast. Sarah saw quaintness. David, however, saw details. The rust bled, but the bolts held. The wood, though splintered, hadn't rotted. The sign had withstood countless brutal winters. It was reliable. A quiet satisfaction settled in the man's chest. He had made the right call. Then the road began to change. Past the sign, the asphalt decayed, the clean yellow line surrendering to tar and cracks. Trees leaned in close, ancient maples and oaks, limbs naked and black against the bruised purple sky, knitting branches overhead, swallowing the last light. The SUV plunged into a tunnel of wood and shadow. The air inside the cabin seemed to thin, growing colder despite the heater's steady hum. David felt a phantom chill slide down his spine, a sensation his mind registered and immediately dismissed as irrational. Wow, it's like a secret tunnel. Lily's voice, bright and clear, sounded strangely tinny in the suddenly claustrophobic space. David didn't answer. his knuckles white on the steering wheel. A sour, metallic taste, the familiar tang of acid reflux absent for weeks, rose in his throat. He swallowed hard, forcing it down. It was just a tree-lined road, an old one, but his mind screamed inefficient, dangerous. The blind corners, lack of shoulder, the canopy holding snow, a flawed design. More than that, the silence outside was wrong, heavy, a woolen thing pressing against the glass. No birds, no squirrels. Only the engine's low hum and the rhythmic hiss of wind through interlocking branches, twisting into a whisper just beyond understanding. David glanced at the phone on his dash. The blue dot pulsed on a blank grid. No signal. His stomach tightened into a cold knot. This was the wilderness of the unknown David so despised. What if a tree fell? What if the car broke down? No signal. A system breaking down. He hated it. "David, you okay?" Sarah's voice was soft, pulling him from the spiral. Clearing his throat, the sound unnaturally loud, David replied, "Fine. Road's just a little narrow here." "It's beautiful," she said, her voice still breathy with wonder. David didn't see beauty. He saw a closing trap. His foot pressed a fraction harder on the accelerator, a primal urge pushing him to get through, to get out. As if sensing his desperation, the tunnel broke. The SUV burst from the shadows back into the dim, bruised light of the valley, revealing Harvest's End nestled below in a bowl of treeless hills. It was exactly like the pictures. A white church steeple aching towards the sky, a single main street lined with brick storefronts, neat little colonial houses with white picket fences huddled together, their backs to vast, harvested cornfields stretching out like a brown, bristled hide. Orderly, contained, a perfect scale model of the peace David had been chasing. The knot in his stomach loosened. This was it. Stability. "Oh, David, it's perfect," Sarah breathed, pure, unburdened relief in her voice this time. He looked in the mirror again, saw her watching him, her eyes shining. Then Lily gasped, her small hand pressing against the rear window. "Daddy, look!" The stick people. David followed her gaze and saw them. In front of the first house, then the next and the next, at the edge of every manicured lawn, guarding every welcoming porch, stood a scarecrow. They weren't cheerful, pumpkin-headed decorations. These were slumped, utilitarian things, crudely stuffed with straw bulging from faded work clothes, a plaid shirt here, denim overalls there. Some wore battered felt hats pulled low. Most were bareheaded, their burlap faces featureless except for one unifying, unnerving detail. Identical black button eyes, sewn with thick, dark thread, staring out with vacant yet focused intensity. David saw the genuine delight on Lily's face, the hopeful smile on Sarah's. He had promised them a new start, a safe harbor, choosing to believe in the model town below, not the unsettling feeling crawling up his spine. "Yeah, honey. Stick people," David said, forcing a smile he didn't feel, his voice a register lower than intended. "Perfect." But as the SUV began its slow descent into the valley, down the main street where every house had its silent, waiting guardian, David couldn't shake the distinct, chilling certainty that from every yard, through every featureless burlap face, dozens of identical black button eyes were watching them arrive. The sound of tearing tape was a small, satisfying violence against the oppressive quiet of the house. David ripped open another box labeled Kitchen Essentials, the methodical action a balm to his frayed nerves. He worked with quiet efficiency, arranging pots and pans into empty cupboards with firm, deliberate movements. Order from chaos. This was how David fought back against the unease settled in his bones. Sarah's voice drifted down from the second floor, light and airy. "Can you believe the closet space up here, David? It's huge." David didn't answer, his focus entirely on creating a neat, defensible perimeter of cardboard and packing paper in the living room. Each box had its zone: kitchen, living room, bedrooms. Lily's things, marked with a bright pink heart drawn by David himself, were prioritized, already stacked by the stairs. This was his process. A laugh bubbled down from upstairs, Lily's this time, echoing slightly in the unfurnished rooms. It was a good sound, confirming his calculations. Sacrificing his career, draining savings, the long drive, all worth it for that sound. David was just slitting the tape on a box of glassware when a shadow fell across the threshold of the open front door. David froze, hand on his box cutter. He hadn't heard a car or footsteps on the porch. The figure just appeared. An old man stood there, silhouetted against the weak afternoon light, tall and stooped, wearing a worn tweed jacket over flannel. His hands were gnarled and thick-knuckled, the hands of someone who had worked the earth. One held the handle of a large wicker basket. He wasn't smiling yet, but his posture was entirely unthreatening. "Didn't mean to startle you," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones rolling in a slow river. "Figured you could use a housewarming." David straightened up slowly, body relaxing by degrees, sliding the box cutter back into his pocket. "David Miller," he said, extending a hand. The old man's grip was surprisingly strong, dry and calloused. "Abernathy. I live just over the rise, been managing these parts since before that oak tree was a sapling." He gestured with his chin toward a massive oak dominating the front yard. "Sarah! We have a visitor!" David called out, his voice a little too loud. The social protocols, the familiar steps of meeting a new neighbor, were a comfort. This was normal, what David wanted. Sarah came down the stairs, wiping dust from her cheek, her face lighting up with that easy, welcoming warmth he always envied. "Oh, hello. I'm Sarah." "A pleasure, ma'am," Abernathy said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he finally offered a smile. It was a good smile, practiced and warm, but didn't quite reach his pale, washed-out blue eyes, which seemed to be assessing, cataloging them. "Brought you a few things from the town larder. A proper welcome to Harvest's End." Abernathy presented the heavy basket to Sarah. David could see the contents, arranged with almost artistic perfection. Apples so red they looked like glass. Ears of corn with uniform, pearlescent gold kernels. A loaf of bread, still warm, a wisp of steam rising from its dark crust. It was an image of impossible bounty, a still life painting of rustic perfection, unlike anything from a supermarket. "Oh my goodness, you shouldn't have," Sarah said, genuinely touched. "This is the kindest thing." "It's what we do," Abernathy replied simply. Just then, Lily came running down the stairs, pigtails bouncing. "Mom, there's a little door in my room, a tiny one." She skidded to a halt upon seeing the stranger, hiding halfway behind David's legs. Abernathy's gaze shifted to the little girl, the polite warmth replaced by a focused, quiet intensity. Not menacing, but appraisal, like a master carpenter examining perfect maple. "And this must be the little queen of the castle," the old man said, his voice softer now. David felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. The compliment was standard, but the tone was not. Sarah nudged Lily forward. "This is Lily. Lily, say hello to Mr. Abernathy." Lily gave a shy wave. Abernathy didn't smile at the child, squatting slowly, old joints creaking until his pale eyes were level with hers. The old man didn't reach out, just looked, his gaze sweeping over her face as if memorizing her features. David's hand came to rest protectively on his daughter's shoulder. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, Sarah's smile faltering. Finally, Abernathy spoke, his voice barely a whisper, a technical observation more than a compliment. "She has the eyes of the soil itself." The words hung in the air, nonsensical and deeply unsettling, fitting no known category of social interaction. David's mind tried to categorize the phrase, finding no box for it. Static, data corrupting the system. He felt a sudden, visceral chill, a cold drop tracing a path down his spine, as if a window opened into a winter night. His hand on Lily's shoulder tightened unconsciously, drawing his daughter a half step closer, a small, almost imperceptible wall being built. Abernathy seemed not to notice, standing up, the warm, neighborly mask sliding perfectly back into place. He gave Sarah a polite nod. "Enjoy the bounty. The festival preparations will be starting soon. We'll see you all there, I'm sure." The old man turned and walked down the porch steps, his footsteps making no sound on the old wood. Sarah was still beaming, holding the impossibly perfect basket. "See? I told you it would be different here. People are so welcoming." David didn't reply, still looking at the empty doorway where Abernathy had stood, his mind replaying the 5 words. The eyes of the soil itself. It wasn't a metaphor, not poetry. It had been said with the flat, certain finality of a diagnosis. The unease now had a specific flavor, a name attached to a face. But David kept it to himself, burying the suspicion under cardboard and the satisfying rhythm of productive work. He would not poison this new beginning, not without proof. For Sarah, the proof came 2 days later, not as a cryptic phrase, but in the one place she had prayed to find normalcy: the laughter of children. The old man's grip was surprisingly strong, dry and calloused. "Abernathy. I live just over the rise, been managing these parts since before that oak tree was a sapling." He gestured with his chin toward a massive oak dominating the front yard. "Sarah! We have a visitor," David called out, his voice a little too loud. The social protocols, the familiar steps of meeting a new neighbor, were a comfort. This was normal, what David wanted. Sarah came down the stairs, wiping dust from her cheek, her face lighting up with that easy, welcoming warmth he always envied. "Oh, hello. I'm Sarah." "A pleasure, ma'am," Abernathy said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he finally offered a smile. It was a good smile, practiced and warm, but didn't quite reach his pale, washed-out blue eyes, which seemed to be assessing, cataloging them. "Brought you a few things from the town larder. A proper welcome to Harvest's End." Abernathy presented the heavy basket to Sarah. David could see the contents, arranged with almost artistic perfection. Apples so red they looked like glass. Ears of corn with uniform, pearlescent gold kernels. A loaf of bread, still warm, a wisp of steam rising from its dark crust. It was an image of impossible bounty, a still life painting of rustic perfection, unlike anything from a supermarket. "Oh my goodness, you shouldn't have," Sarah said, genuinely touched. "This is the kindest thing." "It's what we do," Abernathy replied simply. Just then, Lily came running down the stairs, pigtails bouncing. "Mom, there's a little door in my room, a tiny one." She skidded to a halt upon seeing the stranger, hiding halfway behind David's legs. Abernathy's gaze shifted to the little girl, the polite warmth replaced by a focused, quiet intensity. Not menacing, but appraisal, like a master carpenter examining perfect maple. "And this must be the little queen of the castle," the old man said, his voice softer now. David felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. The compliment was standard, but the tone was not. Sarah nudged Lily forward. "This is Lily. Lily, say hello to Mr. Abernathy." Lily gave a shy wave. Abernathy didn't smile at the child, squatting slowly, old joints creaking until his pale eyes were level with hers. The old man didn't reach out, just looked, his gaze sweeping over her face as if memorizing her features. David's hand came to rest protectively on his daughter's shoulder. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, Sarah's smile faltering. Finally, Abernathy spoke, his voice barely a whisper, a technical observation more than a compliment. "She has the eyes of the soil itself." The words hung in the air, nonsensical and deeply unsettling, fitting no known category of social interaction. David's mind tried to categorize the phrase, finding no box for it. Static, data corrupting the system. He felt a sudden, visceral chill, a cold drop tracing a path down his spine, as if a window opened into a winter night. His hand on Lily's shoulder tightened unconsciously, drawing his daughter a half step closer, a small, almost imperceptible wall being built. Abernathy seemed not to notice, standing up, the warm, neighborly mask sliding perfectly back into place. He gave Sarah a polite nod. "Enjoy the bounty. The festival preparations will be starting soon. We'll see you all there, I'm sure." The old man turned and walked down the porch steps, his footsteps making no sound on the old wood. Sarah was still beaming, holding the impossibly perfect basket. "See? I told you it would be different here. People are so welcoming." David didn't reply, still looking at the empty doorway where Abernathy had stood, his mind replaying the 5 words. The eyes of the soil itself. It wasn't a metaphor, not poetry. It had been said with the flat, certain finality of a diagnosis. The unease now had a specific flavor, a name attached to a face. But David kept it to himself, burying the suspicion under cardboard and the satisfying rhythm of productive work. He would not poison this new beginning, not without proof. For Sarah, the proof came 2 days later, not as a cryptic phrase, but in the one place she had prayed to find normalcy. The laughter of children. The morning air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth, a scent Sarah associated with all the best parts of autumn. It was the smell of homecoming games and cider donuts, of cozy sweaters and the promise of Thanksgiving just around the corner. A gentle sun, the color of weak tea, filtered through the thinning canopy of the maples, dappling the sidewalk in shifting patterns of gold. She held Lily's small hand, her thumb stroking the back of it, and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was it. This was the peace she had been searching for. David, true to form, had been wary, his quiet observations turning into a low-grade hum of anxiety she could feel across the dinner table. But Sarah believed in the goodness of communities, in the simple power of a friendly wave and a shared cup of sugar. She saw the smiles of the townspeople and chose to accept them at face value. Harvest's End was old-fashioned, perhaps, but it was kind. She was sure of it. The Harvest End Elementary School came into view, a handsome brick building that looked as if it had stood for a century. A playground buzzed with the chaotic, joyful energy of children at play. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a basketball, the metallic squeal of swings arcing towards the sky, the overlapping shouts of a game of tag. It was a perfect symphony of the ordinary. It was everything she had hoped for. "Okay, sweetie," Sarah said, mealing to look Lily in the eye. She straightened the collar of her blue jacket, a small, familiar gesture that anchored her. "You remember what Mrs. Gable said? She'll be right inside the front doors." Lily nodded, clutching the straps of her brand-new unicorn backpack. She wasn't nervous. If anything, she seemed to vibrate with a happy, curious energy, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. That was her daughter, resilient, always looking for the next adventure. "Be good. I'll be right here at 3 o'clock, Sarah said, giving her a quick, tight hug. She watched as Lily walked towards the wrought iron gate of the schoolyard. And then it happened. It wasn't a sudden event. It was a cessation. The basketball stopped bouncing, its final thump echoing into a sudden, cavernous silence. The swings slowed, their squeals dying one by one. The running children skidded to a halt. It was as if a conductor had abruptly lowered his baton and the entire orchestra had frozen mid-note. Every child in the schoolyard, from the kindergartners by the sandbox to the older boys on the basketball court, turned. They all turned at once, a silent, synchronous rotation of bodies, to face the small girl in the blue jacket standing at the gate. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A cold prickle, sharp and unpleasant, danced up her arms despite the gentle sun. This wasn't normal. Children were curious, sometimes cruel, but they were never coordinated. Lily, however, seemed unfazed. Bathed in the sudden, undivided attention, she simply stood there, a small, bright figure in a sea of silent observers. Then, a girl who looked to be a few years older, with long blonde hair braided neatly down her back, detached herself from a group by the slide. She walked towards Lily not with the boisterous energy of a child, but with the slow, deliberate grace of an acolyte approaching an altar. She stopped a few feet from Lily. There was no smile. "Welcome to Harvest's End," the older girl said, her voice clear and formal, as if reciting a memorized line. "We've been waiting for you." Sarah's hand, which had been resting on the gate, gripped the cold iron so tightly her knuckles ached. Her mind raced, desperately trying to fit this scene into a familiar framework. It's a welcoming committee, a school tradition. They're just being nice. But her past experience offered no precedent. The blonde girl made a small gesture, and the circle of children parted, creating a clear path for Lily towards the school doors. Lily, taking it all as a grand game in her honor, beamed and walked through the silent parting of the ways, her unicorn backpack bobbing behind her. Sarah stayed rooted to the spot, watching from outside the fence. As the children began to close the circle again, their voices started up, not in a cacophony of play, but in a low, conspiratorial murmur. The wind, rustling the last of the autumn leaves, carried snippets of their whispers to her ears. Definitely her. The eyes, just like they said. The harvest will be good this year. The harvest. Abernathy had said that. Sarah's thumb began to rub frantically back and forth across the cool, smooth surface of her wedding ring, a nervous habit she thought she'd left behind in the city. She's the one. The chosen one, Sarah corrected in her own mind, clinging to the more palatable phrase. It's for a play, a harvest festival play. She's the lead, the harvest queen. It made sense, sort of, a way to make the new kid feel special. Sarah latched on to this explanation, a life raft in a confusing sea. Of course, that had to be it. The school bell rang, a shrill, piercing sound, shattering the strange tension. The children broke their huddle, streaming towards the brick building, hushed whispers dissolving into normal shouts and shoves. Lily glanced back at her mother, gave a final, enthusiastic wave, and disappeared inside with the others. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd held, raising a hand to wave back, though her daughter was already gone. The mother stood there another minute, the playground now empty and silent except for the creak of a single, unoccupied swing moving gently. The logical, comforting explanation felt thin, a flimsy shield against the cold reality of what Sarah had just witnessed. As she turned to walk back to the car, Sarah decided she would tell David, but soften it, framing it as a charming, if slightly eccentric, local custom. She would tell him Lily was already so popular she might star in the school play. No need to feed David's anxiety. But walking away, Sarah couldn't shake the image of all those small faces turned towards her daughter. And for the first time since arriving, Sarah Miller felt a cold, sharp spike of genuine fear. David, meanwhile, was trying to starve his own fear. The decision to take Lily for a walk was calculated, a strategic deployment of normalcy against the creeping insurgency of doubt. Sarah's story about the schoolyard, even softened, had left a residue of unease, another data point that didn't fit. So David initiated a countermeasure, a father-daughter walk through the fields behind their new home, an act so wholesome, so fundamentally safe, it was meant to overwrite the accumulating system errors. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Lily asked, her small hand warm and trusting in his. "Just exploring," David answered, forcing lightness into his tone. "Seeing our kingdom." The afternoon sun, low in the October sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the harvested cornfields. The air was still, carrying the clean, sharp scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The methodical crunch of their footsteps on dry stalks provided a comforting rhythm. This, David told himself, was right. The quiet, the space, the tangible reality of the land. This was the stability purchased for them. The path wound gently, guiding them deeper into the fields. Walls of corn stubble, taller than David, created a living maze muffling the outside world. The familiar hum of distant traffic vanished, replaced by the whisper of a breeze through dead stalks, a dry, sibilant sound, like secrets being passed. David felt a familiar prickle of disorientation, the frustrating loss of a clear line of sight his grid and schematic mind abhorred. Lily, however, was enchanted. Letting go of David's hand, she ran ahead, her bright blue jacket a moving splash of color against the monotonous brown and gold. The child wasn't running aimlessly. She moved with a strange sense of purpose, following the winding path as if walked 100 times before. "Lily, not too far," David called out, his voice sounding flat, absorbed by the corn. No echo. He quickened his pace, the unease from the tree tunnel drive returning. Rounding a sharp bend, the maze opened into a wide, circular clearing, and in the center, Lily stood perfectly still, looking up at the scarecrow. It was immense, far larger than the ones dotting town lawns. Impaled on a thick, dark railroad tie, it loomed over the clearing, a silent, slouching god of the harvest. Its arms were outstretched, not welcomingly, but as if in permanent crucifixion, stretched over a weathered oak crosspiece. It wore the faded, threadbare clothes of a farmer from another century, bleached denim overalls, a plaid flannel shirt worn through at the elbows. Dry, yellowed straw exploded from cuffs and collar. Its head, a heavy burlap sack cinched at the neck with rusted baling wire, slumped forward as if burdened by unspeakable weight. David stopped 20 yards away, a sudden, inexplicable reluctance rooting him. This wasn't a temporary decoration. This was a landmark, a monument. Lily took a tentative step closer, then another, captivated rather than afraid. David watched her, his protector's instinct warring with his desire for her to feel safe here. He catalogued the details, his brain attempting to file the object into a non-threatening category. Folk art, town mascot, Old Man Thresh, a harmless piece of local history. Lily reached the base of the post, bent down and picked a small, stubborn yellow wildflower growing from the packed earth. Then, on tiptoes, the child reached up and gently tucked the flower into the front pocket of the scarecrow's overalls, an act of pure, childish sweetness, an offering. David stood watching, the long shadow of the scarecrow stretching across the clearing to touch the tips of his shoes. The father felt his shoulders relax slightly. It was just a girl and a scarecrow. He was being paranoid. And then David saw it. Not a large movement, but a twitch, an impossible, fractional shift. The burlap head, previously slumped forward, seemed to tilt just a degree or two sideways, towards Lily. David's heart gave a hard, painful lurch against his ribs, a single, violent kick stealing his breath. The air thickened in his throat. His eyes widened, straining to process the signal, raw data defying physics. Thought vanished. His body reacted, adrenaline flooding his veins. David blinked, hard. Nothing. The scarecrow's head remained slumped forward, inanimate, its shadow unchanged. Of course it was. The sun dipping lower, playing tricks with light. A bird landing on the crosspiece, shifting the weight. His own damn exhaustion, his mind primed for anxiety, projecting patterns onto chaos. But the jolt in his chest was real. The icy sweat on the back of his neck was real. "Lily?" David called out, horrified at the raw, strained sound of his own voice. Too loud, too urgent. "Time to go. It's getting late." She turned, her face bright with an untroubled smile. "Okay, Daddy." The little girl ran back to him, taking his hand again. Her hand felt warm. His was clammy and cold. David squeezed it tightly as he led her away, forcing himself not to look back, though he could feel it. A pressure on his back, a weight in the air, the feeling of being watched. David didn't look back until they reached the edge of the field, where their backyard's mown grass began. Risking a final glance over his shoulder, he saw the scarecrow standing exactly where it had been, a dark, unmoving silhouette against the bleeding sunset, motionless. But the flower, the small yellow wildflower Lily had placed in its pocket, was gone. The town square smelled of fried dough and simmering cider, a thick, cloying sweetness clinging to the back of David's throat. A banjo played a cheerful, slightly off-key tune from a makeshift stage, the air filled with laughter. On the surface, it presented a perfect slice of Americana, a Rockwell painting brought to life. But David perceived it through a different filter now, seeing the architecture of a trap. He stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed tightly over his chest, a solitary island of granite in a river of forced merriment. David wasn't participating. He observed, scanned, ran diagnostics. Every smile seemed too wide, every laugh a little too loud. The townspeople moved with an unconscious, synchronized rhythm, like a flock of birds turning in unison. It felt like a performance, and David sensed his family with the unwilling audience. Across the square, Sarah was fully immersed, caught in the current, talking with Mrs. Gable while gesturing with a half-eaten candied apple. She looked relaxed, happy. For a moment, a sharp pang, envy, or maybe profound sadness hit David. She could still see the painting. He could only see the canvas, stretched and pinned, waiting for the final, bloody brushstroke. Lily was a whirlwind of motion, face sticky with cotton candy, darting between game booths. David tried keeping the child in his sightline at all times, a moving target. His objective for the day was simple and absolute: survive this bizarre ritual, keep his daughter close, and get her home. Then Abernathy stepped onto the stage, and a hush fell over the square, the banjo music faltering and dying. "Friends, neighbors," the old man's voice boomed, rich and pastoral. "It is time for the choosing." A wave of eager murmuring passed through the crowd. David felt his muscles tense as he watched two men haul a massive pile of golden straw onto the center of the green, dumping it into a heap as tall as he was. "As is our tradition," Abernathy continued, arms spread wide, "one of our town's children will find the golden kernel and be crowned our harvest queen." A cheer went up, practiced and liturgical. Sarah led Lily by the hand towards the growing crowd of children, giving David a look that pleaded, "Just for a little while, let her be a kid." David gave a stiff, barely perceptible nod, his eyes never leaving the stage. The children swarmed the haystack, a flurry of small bodies diving into the straw. But David's analytical gaze immediately picked up the anomaly. They weren't searching, they were performing. Their movements were inefficient, their digging half-hearted. They turned the straw over, yes, but also unconsciously, or perhaps consciously, herded, creating small, shifting corridors in the pile that subtly converged on one spot near the back. And in the center of that slow-moving, orchestrated chaos was Lily. David watched a boy with red hair accidentally stumble, his fall kicking away straw to reveal the corner of a small, carved wooden box. Another girl on the other side let out a theatrical gasp and pointed, "I think I saw something over there." Her finger aimed directly at the spot. It was a magic trick, and David felt like the only one watching the magician's other hand. "I found it!" Lily's voice, pure and triumphant, cut through the air. She stood up, holding a small wooden kernel, painted a brilliant, gleaming gold, high above her head. The crowd didn't just cheer, they roared, a sound of profound, collective relief, like a congregation whose prayer has been answered. Sarah clapped, beaming with uncomplicated maternal pride. David felt nothing but ice water filling his veins. The children parted for Lily as she walked to the stage, a queen processing through her court, climbing the steps to present the kernel to Abernathy. The old man took it, but his eyes weren't on the object, they were on David. Across 50 feet of open green, their gazes locked. No warmth remained in Abernathy's expression, no folksy charm, only the calm, unblinking finality of a farmer about to bring down an axe. Abernathy took a crown woven from dried corn husks and tied with a black ribbon, placing it gently on Lily's head. The crowd fell silent again, a deep, expectant hush. David's entire world narrowed to the space between him and the man on stage. The festival sounds faded, the smell of fried dough vanished. There was only his daughter in the spotlight, and the old man looking at David as if they were the only two people present. Then Abernathy spoke, his voice clear and resonant, carrying across the square not as a celebration, but as a pronouncement, a verdict. "She will save us all." The words struck David like a physical blow, air rushing from his lungs, the edges of his vision swimming into a nauseating smear. The ensuing roar of the crowd was a distant, meaningless noise, like the ocean heard from inside a sealed container. Everything snapped into painful, hyper-real focus. Sarah's ecstatic face, Lily's innocent smile beneath the brittle crown, and Abernathy's serene, pitiless eyes. The fear was gone. Fear is the currency of uncertainty, a tax on the unknown. What replaced it was cold, hard, absolute certainty. David was no longer a worried father in a strange town. He was a paramedic at the scene of a catastrophic failure, the illusion of safety stripped away to reveal the raw mechanics of disaster. The system wasn't just flawed, the system was the threat. David met Abernathy's gaze, letting the old man see the full, unshielded weight of his understanding, and gave a single, slow nod. Not agreement, not surrender, but an acceptance of the terms of engagement. The game was no longer secret. David was locked in. You couldn't fight an enemy you didn't understand. The gnawing fear from the festival, wild and chaotic, began to cool and harden in David's gut, becoming something else, something focused. A problem to be solved, a system to be dismantled. The first step was to find the manual. The heavy oak door of the Harvest's End Public Library groaned shut behind David. the sound swallowed instantly by a profound and layered silence. It wasn't empty, but a physical presence, woven from the scent of old paper and beeswax, the faint rustle of turning pages, and the almost imperceptible hum of overhead fluorescent lights. Dust motes danced in long shafts of sunlight slanting from tall, arched windows. For the first time since arriving, a part of David's tightly wound internal mechanism relaxed. This place made sense. Orderly shelves, a card catalog, the Dewey Decimal System, a fortress of facts and rules, a sanctuary his mind could navigate. A woman sat behind a massive circulation desk, her white hair in a severe bun. She looked up from her book as David approached, her smile as neatly arranged as the pens beside her. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice was soft but carried a crisp, no-nonsense edge. "Just arrived in town," David said, keeping his own voice neutral. "David Miller. My family and I bought the old Hemlock place." The librarian's smile widened a fraction, but her eyes, magnified behind thick spectacles, remained sharp and analytical. "Ah, the Millers. We've been expecting you. A lovely property. I'm Mrs. Davison. Welcome to Harvest's End." The phrase, "we've been expecting you," sent a timey, cold signal up David's spine, but he ignored it, a standard pleasantry. The newcomer was here for data, not social nuance. "I'm interested in the town's history. The founding, agricultural records, that sort of thing. Where would I find that?" "On the Stater, local history section, back left corner," Mrs. Davison said, gesturing with a hand laden with silver rings. "Right past the genealogies. Let me know if you need anything at all." Her gaze lingered on David a moment longer than necessary before returning to her book, a sentry at her post. The local history section was a single, imposing bookshelf filled with handsome, leather-bound volumes. David ran his fingers over their spines. A complete history of Harvest's End, 1699 to 1950, the founding families, bountiful years, an agricultural chronicle. They were all in perfect condition, gold leaf lettering bright, leather supple. Too perfect, like props on a stage set. David pulled out the thickest volume, the Complete History, and settled at a heavy oak table, reassured by the book's weight. Opening it, the pages cracked softly, thick and creamy, the typeface elegant. David didn't read, he scanned, his former profession having trained him to triage information, find the bleed amidst the noise. His eyes jumped through dense blocks of text, hunting keywords: drought, famine, sickness, winter, fire, death. Nothing. David spent the next hour dissecting the town's past. According to these immaculate records, Harvest's End was a historical anomaly, a pocket of uninterrupted prosperity in a region defined by hardship. Brutal winters decimating other settlements were merely brisk here. The Great New England Drought of the 1880s was a footnote about a dry summer. No major fires, no cholera or influenza outbreaks, no starvation periods. Page after page documented bountiful harvests, healthy livestock, steady growth. It was the most terrifying thing David had ever read. David was a lie, a meticulously constructed, perfectly maintained lie. David's own mind, a repository of historical facts, knew this was impossible. Like reading a 150-year-old man's medical chart listing only routine checkups. The absence of tragedy was the proof. Frustration, hot and sharp, began to prickle. He felt stonewalled by dead men. Closing the book with a quiet thud, David returned it to the shelf, the librarian's eyes briefly flicking up. He moved along the wall to a smaller, less prominent shelf labeled Town Records and Miscellanea, the discard pile, the attic. Here, books were a chaotic jumble. Town meeting minutes from the 1920s,
church donation ledgers, and tucked away on the bottom shelf, almost hidden, was a small, untitled book bound in faded green cloth. When this one felt different in David's hands. The cover was soft and frayed, the spine weakened, smelling not just of old paper but of damp soil and something faintly metallic. Opening it revealed a farmer's almanac, pages filled with handwritten entries in a spidery, almost illegible script dating back to the late 1800s. A record of planting dates, rainfall, crop yields. Mundane, real.
David sat back down, his heart starting to beat a little faster. Turning the pages, the brittle paper threatening to crumble, he scanned the entries, looking for discrepancies, anything contradicting the official narrative. David found it on a page dated 1894. The entry for October was a frantic, blotchy scrawl, contrasting starkly with the neat script on preceding pages, detailing a month of no rain, withering crops, dying cattle. It spoke of a fear David recognized. And then he saw the gaps. Several pages following the October entry had been ripped out, not cut, but torn, leaving a ragged, angry fringe. The violence of the act, preserved for over a century, was jarring. Someone hadn't just wanted to remove information. They had wanted to obliterate it. David's breath hitched. Running his thumb over the torn edge, another detail caught his eye. Near the binding, something had been added long after. A faint, almost invisible line of pencil, written in a different, shakier hand. David had to angle the page to the light to read the two words. The soil demands. Slamming the book shut, the sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent library. A jolt, electric and fierce, shot through him. The librarian's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. David felt a hot flush of panic, the certainty of being caught, of stumbling upon something forbidden. He forced himself to take a slow breath, looking down at his own trembling hands, clenching them into fists. David glanced at the librarian again. She was still watching him, her pleasant mask gone, replaced by cold, unwavering appraisal. With a movement both clumsy and deliberate, David stood up. He didn't put the book back, holding it tightly instead. Walking to the front, he looked directly at Mrs. Davison. "I'd like to check this one out," David said, his voice steady. She held his gaze for a long moment. A silent battle of wills fought across the desk. Then, her lips curved back into that practiced smile. "Of course, Mr. Miller," Mrs. Davison replied, her voice smooth as cream again. She didn't reach for the book immediately, but tapped a long fingernail on the counter beside it. "Enjoy your reading. It's a fascinating piece, though we find most of our history tends to repeat itself." Pushing the heavy oak door, David stepped back out into the deceptively peaceful afternoon, the weight of the small, tattered book feeling less like a clue and more like a weapon. Or a death sentence. Night had fallen thick and starless over the valley, pressing against the windows of the old house. The only light in the living room came from a single bare-bulb lamp, casting a harsh, lonely circle of yellow on the dining table, leaving the rest to grasping shadows. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sarah and Lily were upstairs asleep, their peaceful breathing a fragile melody David felt a desperate need to protect. He sat at the table, a general surveying a battlefield of paper. The orderly system created earlier now felt like a mockery. To his left, printouts of the town's sanitized history. To his right, a hand-drawn map, the winding road marked with a single damning red line. In the center, under the stark glare, lay the two pieces that mattered, the crumbling farmer's almanac and the carefully torn page. "The soil demands." The phrase was a splinter in David's mind. He'd spent the last hour trying to build a case, construct a framework for the wrongness of this place. Working methodically, systematically, David highlighted newspaper clippings of bumper crops from years that should have been droughts, cross-referenced the town's founding date with records of the Salem trials. But the pieces wouldn't fit. A puzzle with a missing corner, a machine with a ghost in its gears. Picking up the almanac again, the brittle paper cool and dry, David ignored the main entries, the neat records of rainfall and planting. His focus was on the back, on the list of names scrawled in faint pencil inside the cloth cover. A list hidden, forgotten. Abigail, 1840. Samuel, 1867. Esther, 1894. They were just names, ghosts on a page. David pulled out his phone, the calculator app bright in the dim room, his fingers tapping the screen. 1,867 minus 1,840. The screen flashed the result. 27. A cold, prickling sensation traced a path up his arms. Coincidence? It had to be. He continued. 1,894 minus 1,867. 27. The chill was no longer on his skin. It resided inside his bones. The air in the room felt heavy, thin. David saw the next name on the list, a name that made his breath catch. Sarah Jane, 1981. His thumb hovered over the calculator. David didn't want to do the math, feeling a sudden, irrational urge to throw the book, burn the page, pretend he hadn't found it. But he couldn't. The need to know, to understand the system, was stronger than fear. He typed the numbers. 1981 plus 27. 2008. This year. And then another number surfaced in David's memory, unbidden. A ghost from a different grave. Not a year, but a date. October 27th. The date from the accident on Route 9, seared into his memory. The world tilted. The quiet hum of the refrigerator dissolved into the high-pitched, receding wail of a siren. The smell of old paper vanished, replaced by the acrid stench of gasoline and the coppery tang of blood. The warm lamplight warped into the fractured, strobing blue and red of emergency flashers on rain-slicked asphalt. David wasn't in the house anymore. He was back on Route 9, rain coming down in cold, merciless sheets. He saw it in searing snapshots, shattered glass like diamonds in mud. A small pink hair clip in a puddle, its plastic unicorn staring up. The groan of metal as the fire crew used the jaws of life. The feeling of the cold, dented car door under David's own hands, fingers slipping as he tried to pry it open. The smell. He would never forget the smell. David slammed his eyes shut, but the images were burned onto his eyelids. "Sir, you have to step back." He was pushing, pulling, training, screaming to check for neck injuries, stabilize, follow procedure. But the girl's eyes were open, looking right at him. She was Lily's age. David shoved the dining table away, legs scraping a harsh protest against the floor. The sound, loud and real, shattered the memory. He stood up, breathing in ragged gasps, hands pressed against his head as if to keep it from splitting. The living room swam back into focus, shadows no longer just an absence of light, but living things clinging to the corners. David stood trembling, cold sweat plastering his shirt to his back. The house fell silent again, but the siren's echo remained, a phantom ringing. David looked back at the table, at the list of names. Abigail, Samuel, Esther, Sarah Jane. They weren't abstract historical entries anymore, not data points. They were children. A cycle. Every 27 years, a tragedy in autumn. A little girl he couldn't save on October 27th. And now another, his little girl. The newly crowned Harvest Queen, sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware the pattern converged on her. The theme wasn't about a town. It was about repetition, about him, a cosmic, cruel joke forcing David to relive his greatest failure. But this time, the stakes infinitely higher. David stared down at the scattered papers, the map, the meaningless, highlighted histories. All his methods, systems, careful analysis, useless. He was a man with a blueprint trying to fight a hurricane. His gaze drifted towards the stairs leading to Lily's room. A heavy, familiar weight settled in his chest. Cold metal, falling rain, the crushing weight of failure. This wasn't a town's curse, David fought. It was his own. A test, a second chance to get it right. Or a final, damning opportunity to fail all over again. It was a test, a second chance to get it right, or a final, damning opportunity to fail all over again. The realization didn't bring panic, but a terrible, cold clarity. David spent the rest of the night not sleeping, but planning. Fear became background noise, a constant hum beneath the sharp, clear signal of his objective: get his family out. But first, he had to make his wife a believer. The kitchen smelled of coffee and the determined normalcy Sarah had been trying to build. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the small universe of home Sarah desperately tried holding together. Clean mugs were stacked. She brewed a second pot, the rhythmic gurgle a small anchor in her rising anxiety. It was a normal morning. She would make it normal. Then David came downstairs. The man didn't walk so much as pace, a caged animal. He hadn't shaved, dark circles pooled under his eyes, contrasting with his frantic, focused energy. The breakfast Sarah made sat untouched, growing cold. Sarah's instinct was to soothe. "David, please, just sit down and eat something," she said gently, offering peace. David stopped pacing, his eyes seeing something far away and terrible. "There's no time for that." He strode to the table, slapping a sheaf of papers down, the sound making Sarah flinch. On top lay the torn, yellowed almanac page, its cryptic scrawl like a stain. "Look," David urged, voice low. "Just look at the facts." Sarah took a deep breath, hand tightening around her warm coffee mug. She wanted harmony, wanted to believe in friendly faces and perfect apples, wanted, more than anything, for her husband to be wrong, for this to be another phantom conjured by trauma he refused to discuss. "David, no, just listen." His finger tapped the printout of the town history. No disasters, no famines, no plagues, for 300 years, in New England. Does that make sense? David didn't wait for an answer, his finger moving to the list of names. And this. A name, every 27 years, like clockwork. The last one was 1981. Add 27, Sarah. What do you get? The cold dread from the schoolyard returned to Sarah. She looked at the papers, at the frantic logic of underlines and circled dates. It's a coincidence, honey. Small towns have strange legends. You're tired, not sleeping. Each sentence was a plea to pull him back. David let out a short, harsh, humorless laugh. A coincidence? They crowned our daughter, Sarah, in front of everyone. Abernathy looked me in the eye. He's a sweet old man, Sarah countered weakly. They were making her feel special. Communities do that.
"They don't welcome people," David shot back, voice rising, cracking with terrifying desperation. "They choose them. They chose Lily, right in front of us." The accusation hung, ugly and sharp, an attack on Sarah's belief. The conflict wasn't just about a strange town. It was about their opposing worlds, his hidden threats and failing systems, hers human connection as the ultimate good. Sarah put her mug down loudly. Looking at David's wild eyes, the tremor in his hands, a terrible, familiar grief washed over her. She had seen this pattern before, the retreat into facts and worst-case scenarios after the accident. The way David shut her out, trying to solve their shared grief like a faulty engine. Her voice, when Sarah spoke, was quiet and heavy with that memory. "No, David," she said, the words feeling like stones. "You're choosing her. You're looking for a disaster to prevent, because you can't forgive yourself for the one you couldn't." It was a direct hit, a cruel truth wielded in fear. Sarah saw the impact in his eyes. The frantic energy didn't just stop, it evaporated, leaving a vast, empty coldness. Color drained from David's face, his shoulders slumped. He stared at her, not angry, but utterly, devastatingly wounded.
David didn't argue or defend himself, just gave a single slow shake of his head, a gesture of profound, final defeat. The silence that followed was worse than shouting, an invisible wall of glass rising between them. Then, without another word, David began gathering his papers, movements slow, deliberate, each piece collected and squared into a neat pile. It was the action of a man retreating, pulling forces back behind a line Sarah could no longer cross. Sarah's heart ached with instant regret. She reached out a hand. "David, But he was already turning away, walking out of the kitchen and up the stairs, footsteps heavy and even on the old wood. David didn't slam the door, he just went. Sarah was left alone in the bright, sunlit kitchen, the coffee scent suddenly sickening. She looked out the window, past their yard, to the edge of the cornfields. The peace felt this morning was gone, replaced by a gnawing, terrifying doubt. What if he was right? What if his world, the one of hidden threats and terrible patterns, was the real one? And Sarah had just left him to face it, entirely alone. The silence lasted for 3 hours, dense and suffocating, thicker than the evening fog creeping up from the fields. David didn't come back down. Sarah didn't go up. She moved through the half-unpacked house in a daze, her attempts at creating a home now feeling like playing with doll furniture in a house already on fire. Sarah put Lily to bed, reading her a story about a princess in a faraway castle, the words like ash in her mouth. She was in the living room, staring at the dark TV screen, when Sarah heard his footsteps on the stairs. Different now. Not heavy and defeated, but quick, quiet, purposeful. David appeared in the doorway, not looking at her, already wearing his jacket. "Get your coats," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The detached, operational tone used at accident scenes, walling off all feeling. "Both of you. We're leaving." Now Sarah's heart leaped. A protest formed, but the look in David's eyes stopped her. The wounded emptiness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty, more frightening than rage. This was not a man open to debate. "David, what are you doing?" "It's nearly 10 o'clock. "I'm getting my family to safety," David stated, already moving to grab Lily's small jacket. "You can either help me, or you can get in the car." Something in David's unwavering resolve broke through Sarah's denial. The image of the silent, staring children in the schoolyard flashed in her mind. The weight of Abernathy's strange pronouncement. Sarah found herself moving, not out of agreement, but from a sudden, overwhelming fear of being left behind. They moved in a tense, silent flurry. David scooped a still sleeping Lily from bed, bundling her into her jacket. Sarah grabbed her purse and phone. David didn't grab suitcases. This wasn't a move, but an evacuation. The SUV started with a healthy roar. David cut across the damp lawn, tires spinning momentarily before finding purchase. Headlights sliced the darkness as David swung the vehicle onto the main road, away from the town center, towards the single artery leading out of the valley. For a few minutes, fragile hope blossomed. The dark, sleeping houses of Harvest's End flashed past, the town square empty. A hysterical laugh almost escaped Sarah's lips. It was all just a bad dream. They would be on the highway in 5 minutes. Then they entered the tunnel of trees. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence swallowing the headlight beams. Intertwined branches blotting out the moonless sky. David's hands clamped onto the steering wheel, his focus absolute. And then, nothing. Not a sputter, not a cough, but an instantaneous, total cessation. The engine cut out, headlights died, dashboard went dark. The car plunged into blackness so complete, it felt like being submerged in ink. Rolling forward another 20 feet on momentum, the crunching of stray leaves the only sound, before coming to a dead, silent stop. What was that? Sarah's voice was a sharp, frightened whisper. David didn't answer. The sound of him turning the key was a series of frantic, useless clicks. Click, 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 click. Small and pathetic in the vast, suffocating silence. David? David hit the steering wheel with the heel of his hand. "I don't know. It's dead. Completely dead." Fumbling for his phone, its screen a blinding rectangle, he switched on the flashlight. "Stay here. Lock the doors." Getting out, the cold was immediate and biting, the air unnaturally still. David popped the hood, the phone's light dancing over the engine block. Everything looked normal. Battery terminals secure, no leaking fluids. A modern car didn't just die like this. Slamming the hood shut, the sound echoed unnervingly. And that's when David felt it, the same pressure on his back from the cornfield, the feeling of being watched. Slowly, David raised his head, sweeping the phone's light into the dense wall of trees. The beam was too weak, illuminating only a few feet of damp bark before being swallowed. At first, he saw nothing, but as his eyes adjusted, David began to pick out shapes that didn't belong, silhouettes. Tall, thin forms standing just beyond the light, half hidden behind ancient trees, perfectly still. He couldn't make out faces, just lumpy burlap heads and slumped shoulders in old work clothes. 1, then another. 5, 10. Sweeping the light back and forth, more resolved from the darkness, a silent, unmoving gallery of observers. They weren't blocking the road or holding weapons, they were just there, witnesses. The walls of the prison. A sound from the car made David turn. Sarah had gotten out, her own phone's light trembling, her face a pale, terrified mask.
She saw what he saw. A choked, strangled sob escaped her lips. The hope David had allowed himself moments before felt like a cruel, childish fantasy. They weren't just leaving. They were never meant to. David looked at Sarah, at the car, now just a metal coffin, at the silent, watching figures in the trees. He didn't look at the watchers anymore, turning his back on them. With a weariness settling into his bones, David walked to the back of the SUV, opened the door, and unbuckled his sleeping daughter. Lifting Lily into his arms, her body warm and limp against his chest, he started walking without a word. Back the way they came. Back towards the faint, distant glow of town. Back into the trap. There was no other road. David hadn't to it. David hadn't seen Sarah's face when she saw the figures, but he'd heard her strangled sob, the sound of her world breaking, like his had years ago. He had led them here. This wasn't a repetition of past failure, it was the consequence. The walk back was a silent, suffocating journey. David carried Lily, her small body a warm, trusting weight, her breath ghosting his neck. Sarah walked beside him, a phantom in the dark, shoulders occasionally brushing, neither speaking. The air was thick with unspoken terror. The figures in the woods had vanished, leaving only the oppressive presence of trees. When their house came into view, a single light burning like a lonely lighthouse, it didn't feel like a sanctuary, but a cage they willingly returned to. The rain started as David fumbled with the key, a soft, mournful patter on the porch roof. Setting Lily down inside, her sleep undisturbed, he shrugged off his damp jacket. Sarah, staring out into the rain-swept darkness, suddenly stiffened. "David," she whispered, voice tight. He turned, following her gaze. A figure walked up their path through the downpour with a slow, steady gait, a black umbrella held high. David's body went rigid, every muscle coiled. His calm, procedural mind was instantly overridden by primal, protective rage. Not here. Not in my home. But Sarah moved first. The woman paralyzed by fear an hour ago was now propelled by the cold, absolute fury of a mother defending her young. Before David could stop her, Sarah wrenched the front door open, stepping out to block the threshold, a small, defiant figure against the storm. Aberners stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, rain drumming steadily on his umbrella, water streaming from its edges, forming a dark circle around him. He wasn't armed or flanked by villagers, just an old man standing in the rain.
"Get out," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerously steady, a blade sharpened on fear, not a shout. "Leave us alone." Abernathy didn't flinch, simply looking at her, his face illuminated by the porch light. What Sarah saw stopped her next words. His expression wasn't malicious or authoritative, but one of profound, bone-deep weariness. The lines on his face seemed carved by grief, his pale eyes filled with a sorrow so vast it seemed ancient. The old man looked less like a monster and more like a pallbearer at a funeral attended 1,000 times before. "I cannot do that, Mrs. Miller," Abernathy said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the rain. "I can only explain." The righteous anger inside Sarah suddenly sputtered. Prepared for a fight, for a monster, she hadn't prepared for this quiet, resigned sadness. Her hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist, slowly uncurled. "We can go inside," Abernathy suggested wearily, not commanded. "It will be quick. And I am truly sorry." That phrase broke Sarah. Truly sorry. Spoken with unmistakable sincerity, the apology of a man carrying out a terrible but necessary duty. Her fury lost its target, leaving only terrifying, disorienting confusion. Sarah looked over her shoulder at David, her eyes wide with a question. He stood just behind her, face an unreadable mask of stone, but she saw his almost imperceptible nod, a reluctant concession, an acknowledgement they had no other move. Taking a shaky step back, Sarah opened the door wider, a silent, unwilling invitation. Abernathy furled his umbrella on the porch, shaking off water with practiced motion before stepping inside, bringing the cold and the smell of wet earth with him. He stood, slumped in the entryway, waiting. The moment felt surreal, a nightmare playing out under the harsh domestic light. Sarah's mind, previously a sharp point of maternal rage, was now a chaotic whirl. Nothing about this man fit the assigned role. The monster should snarl, threaten, take. This man just looked tired, like he was mourning. Staring at the deep, sad lines around Abernathy's eyes, a single, horrifying question formed. Why did the executioner look like he was losing everything? Abernathy methodically unbuttoned his damp tweed jacket, draping it over a hard wooden dining chair, an act of obscene, mundane domesticity. David remained standing, arms crossed, a physical barrier. Across the room, Sarah sank onto the sofa's edge, hands twisted in her lap. Only the sad, rhythmic drumming of rain against the window panes broke the silence. The old man pulled out another chair, turning it to face them before sitting upright, gnarled hands resting on his knees. "This is not a land of blessings, Mr. Miller," Abernathy began, his voice low and even, stripped of earlier warmth, like a historian. "It never was. When our founders arrived in the late 1600s, fleeing Salem's madness, they found punishment, not a promised land. Thin, rocky soil, merciless winters. They starved." He paused, letting the simple, brutal word settle. "The town histories," David started, voice tight, "are stories we tell children and ourselves." Abernathy cut him off, not unkindly. "A necessary fiction. The truth is, by that first winter's end, they neared cannibalism. Desperate men will do anything for another sunrise." His gaze drifted past them, towards the dark windows, and in desperation, they listened. To the land. "There is something in this soil, Mr. Miller, ancient. Here, before trees, before men, it is hungry and generous. It offered a covenant, a simple, terrible transaction." Leaning forward slightly, Abernathy's pale eyes found David's. "It gives us life, bountiful life, crops never failing, animals never sick, people living long, healthy lives. In return, we feed it. We give it life in kind." Breath stalled in David's lungs. "What are you talking about?" Sarah whispered from the sofa. Abernathy's attention remained fixed on David. "We are farmers, Mrs. Miller. But our primary crop isn't corn. It's ensuring this town's continuation. Every 27 years, the soil demands a tithe, a sowing, to replenish the energy it expends, keeping us all alive." "A child," David said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. Abernathy gave a slow, solemn nod. "The land prefers the brightest spark. The purest energy, a child on the cusp of understanding, but still full of uncorrupted life. It is a law of nature, as immutable as gravity." David's reeling mind grasped for a counterargument. Then why not leave? Why would anyone agree to live like this? For the first time, a flicker of impatience crossed the old man's face. Leave? To go where? To the factories and slums, trading prosperity for a slow death of poverty and disease? We are not monsters, Mr. Miller. We are pragmatists, survivors. What we do ensures hundreds may live. It is a harvest, not a murder. The clinical detachment, the awful, unassailable system made David dizzy. This wasn't madness, it was something far worse, a functioning, horrifying system. David took a step forward. And Lily, the festival, the crown. The town watches, Abernathy said simply. The land resonates, drawn to a particular vitality. It chose your daughter from the day you arrived. The festival merely formalizes the selection, honors the sacrifice. Honoring it? Sarah's voice cracked. You're talking about killing our daughter. Abernathy finally turned to Sarah, his expression softening into genuine, weary pity. We are talking about saving our own. David's mind raced, seizing one last variable. So you brought us here, sold us the house, led us into this. Abernathy held David's gaze. Yes, founding families are exempt. The tithe must come from those newly planted. We chose you, Mr. Miller, sensing a strength, a resilience. We knew you would understand the system's necessity, its terrible logic. The calm, direct confession was a gut punch. They weren't just unlucky, they had been selected, hunted. A wave of nausea washed over David. He saw Abernathy not as a person, but as a priest, explaining the divine necessity of the altar. The system was perfect, sealed, the awful math flawless. In that moment of intellectual defeat, something else rose in David. A force beyond systems or logic, a primitive, absolute truth. He looked straight into Abernathy's sad, ancient eyes, his own voice trembling but clear. My daughter, David said, each word a stone, is not a crop. The statement hung in the air, a declaration of war against this world's fundamental laws. Abernathy held his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable, respect, disappointment, passing through his eyes. Then the old man stood up. The explanation was over. Abernathy walked to the door, picked up his jacket, put it on. Halloween night, he said, hand on the doorknob, voice flat and procedural again. At dusk, the scarecrow will come for her. I pray you do not make it difficult. Abernathy opened the door, stepped into the rain, and closed it softly, leaving them in ringing silence, in the horrifying clarity of the truth. The soft click of the front door closing was louder than a gunshot. For a long time, neither moved. David remained leaning against the wall, turned to stone. Sarah sat frozen on the sofa, Abernathy's monstrously airtight logic replaying, her mind finding no purchase. The house was no longer a home. It was a waiting room. The only sound was the steady, relentless drumming of rain. Sarah stared at the welcome basket on the coffee table. Polished red apples like congealed blood, the golden loaf an obscene tumor of false hospitality. An absurd, violent urge to hurl it against the wall seized her, but she didn't move. Across the room, David was a statue of gray despair, face slack, eyes fixed on the middle distance. The invisible wall between them stood a mile high. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Sarah stood. She needed to see Lily. Not a thought, but a biological imperative, to confirm the one piece of data still mattering in this insane world. Sarah walked up the stairs,
the familiar creak of the third tread sounding like a cry of pain. Passing their own bedroom, the unmade bed a stark reminder of a life ended hours ago. She stopped before Lily's door, hand hovering over the cool brass knob, paralyzed by fear. What if the town's monstrous logic had already leached through the walls, tainting the last safe place on Earth?
Forcing the fear down, Sarah turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was just a child's room, steeped in quiet, reassuring darkness, lit only by a plastic star projector casting a soft galaxy across the ceiling. And in the bed, under a pink comforter, was Lily. Sarah moved to the bedside, a ghost in the dim light, simply watching the slow, even rise and fall of her daughter's small chest. Lily's scent, soap, sleep, and something uniquely hers. These were the facts, the immutable truths Sarah's being could cling to. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Sarah reached out a trembling hand, hovering it over her daughter to feel the warmth radiating from her small body. The mother looked at her, really looked. The freckles, the small chip on her front tooth from a fall, the determined set of her jaw, even in sleep, inherited from her father. Abernathy's logic, one life for hundreds, crashed against the simple reality of this sleeping child. This wasn't a system or an equation. This was Sarah's universe. And a new axiom, more powerful than any ancient covenant, forged itself within her. This child will live. The shock, the numb state encasing Sarah, finally cracked. Not with tears, but something else. A cold, clear anger. The gentle, peace-seeking part of her withered and died. In its place, something harder, forged in pure, protective fire, began to solidify. The numbness in Sarah's limbs receded, replaced by sharp, focused energy. Her mind, previously a chaotic storm of fear, became still and clear, no longer seeing 100 terrible possibilities, only one objective. Standing up, movements now steady and sure, Sarah pulled the comforter up to Lily's chin, her touch gentle but firm. Then she turned, walked out, and closed the door with a soft, decisive click. She went downstairs. David was still by the wall but had moved, looking at Sarah as she descended. She could see the question in his eyes, the expectation of tears, of the emotional collapse he was probably too exhausted to handle. He wouldn't get one. Sarah stopped at the bottom step, meeting David's gaze across the shadowed room. He saw the change in her face, the absence of fear, the arrival of something unrecognized. It wasn't the wife who had doubted him, not the woman who had accused him of chasing ghosts. It was someone else, someone David hadn't met yet. The amorphous fog of shock and grief that had filled Sarah's mind burned away, leaving a single, hard point of crystalline certainty. The tears she expected never came. They froze deep inside, turning from salt water into steel. Rising from her daughter's bedside, Sarah was a different woman. She walked down the stairs not into despair, but into war. David stood by the living room window, a silhouette against rain-streaked glass, a sentry guarding a lost cause, the weight of their grim reality pressing down. He had braced himself for Sarah's inevitable emotional storm, screaming, accusations, breakdown. He was ready to absorb it, his duty, his penance. Hearing Sarah's slow, measured footsteps on the stairs, David braced himself, turning from the window as she reached the bottom. But the storm never came. The woman before him was not the wife David knew. The gentle, peace-seeking softness was gone, stripped away to reveal an unnerving, quiet stillness.
Her face was pale, but her eyes stopped the air in David's lungs. Confusion and fear were replaced by a focused, glacial calm he had never seen. The look of a surgeon before the first incision. Sarah didn't rush to him or cry. She stopped in the center of the room, her gaze not a plea, but a summons. "Lock the door," Sarah said. Her voice was flat, a simple two-word command delivered with no inflection, not a suggestion, but an order. David stared, his exhausted mind struggling to process this new, impossible variable. He had prepared for a victim. Instead, he faced a commander. David didn't move, momentarily paralyzed.
Sarah didn't repeat herself or wait. With a fluid, economical motion, she turned, walked to the front door, and shot the deadbolt home. The heavy clack of the metal bolt was a sharp, percussive sound, establishing a perimeter. Turning back to face David, her expression remained unchanged. "All the windows. Check them." Now he saw the flicker of her old self in the way Sarah wrung her hands, a single tell that this composure cost her everything. But the voice, the eyes, they belonged to someone else. It was the sight of her barely suppressed tremor that finally broke David's paralysis. This wasn't a lack of feeling, it was feeling so immense it had compressed into a diamond-hard point of resolve. He was witnessing the raw, terrifying power of a mother's love. David had spent the last 24 hours utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare only he could see. Now, unexpectedly, he was no longer alone. The crushing weight on his shoulders suddenly felt lighter. He didn't speak, just gave Sarah a single, sharp nod. That was all she needed. No discussion, no embrace, just a silent, mutual acknowledgement that the argument was over. The debate between his paranoia and her hope was moot. They were united by the horrifying clarity of a shared enemy. The invisible wall between them hadn't been dismantled by forgiveness. It had shattered with the declaration of war. David moved to the large picture window, his own actions now infused with new energy. His hands were steady, checking the latch, flimsy, meant for wind, not siege. Looking at the vast, dark front yard, he no longer saw a yard, but a field of fire. Sarah was already in the kitchen. David heard the rattle of the junk drawer. Walking in, he found her laying out their meager arsenal, a heavy-duty flashlight, a meat tenderizer, the longest, sharpest carving knife. They began to work, a silent, efficient team. David went through the house room by room, checking every lock, his mind fully engaged in threat assessment, no longer a grieving ex-paramedic, but a tactician. Sarah followed, fear channeled into furious, methodical energy, pulling curtains shut, plunging the house into deeper gloom, wedging kitchen chairs under doorknobs. Every action was a small defiance. The work anchored them. David moved to the dark, musty basement, smelling of damp earth and forgotten time. The single pull-chain bulb cast sickly yellow light over chaotic detritus. Rusted paint cans, old newspapers, a cluttered workbench. To David's methodical mind, this wasn't junk. It was an arsenal. He worked with silent, consuming focus, seeing the house not as a home, but a tactical problem, assessing weaknesses. The picture window, the flimsy back door lock, the vulnerable staircase, each a potential breach needing sealing or weaponizing. Sarah worked alongside him, a silent partner, anticipating needs, following his lead. The first task was windows. David found old plywood, the rhythmic slam of hammer against nail becoming the house's new heartbeat, a violent, angry sound driving stakes through suffocating silence. Each nail was a denial, each board a protest. Next, traps. Under a dusty tarp, David found it,
a massive, jawed bear trap, teeth thick with rust, a relic of savage mechanics. He carried it upstairs. Setting it was a delicate, terrifying dance. Boot on the spring, pressing down with all his weight, metal groaning an awful screech, hands steady setting the trigger plate. David slid the armed trap under the living room window, camouflaging it with a throw rug, a silent, waiting mouth. He and Sarah turned furniture into a barricade, upending the heavy sofa against the front door, wedging the dining table against the hallway entrance, creating choke points, kill zones. Then, weapons. Kitchen knives were a start, but for close work, David needed reach. In the basement, he found them. A long-handled garden hoe, a heavy spade with a sharpened edge, and an old, beautifully curved scythe, its wooden handle smooth and dark with age. Bringing them upstairs, David leaned the spade and hoe near the barricaded hallway, ready.
The scythe, heavier and far more deadly, felt different. David took it back down to the workbench, clamping it down, and ran a whetstone along its curved blade. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on stone, a meditative, terrible sound, counterpointed the drumming rain. When finished, the blade had a cold, hungry edge. David needed it accessible, but out of the way, his eyes glancing towards the back porch fireplace through the kitchen window. Slipping out the back door, the rain cold on his face, David hung the ancient scythe on two heavy iron hooks above the fireplace. A piece of rustic decoration, a grim joke waiting for its true purpose. Coming back inside and locking the door, David looked at his own scraped, dirty hands. They no longer felt like a failure's hands, but like those of a craftsman, a builder, a protector. He looked around the darkened, fortified room, a pathetic fortress, a child's blanket fort against a hurricane. But it was theirs, a stand, a choice. The answer would come with the night. Waiting was a unique form of torture. David sat on the hard dining chair positioned in the living room's center, a crude command post. The sharpened garden hoe lay cool and solid across his lap. Every nerve hummed with high-frequency dread. David wasn't just waiting. He was listening. His world shrunk to sensory input, cataloging every sound, searching for the anomaly. The house drummed with small noises, old wood groaning, a mouse scratching behind the wall, the steady, maddening tick-tock, tick-tock of the antique clock, each second a drop of water on exposed nerves. From the armchair, David could hear the soft rhythm of Sarah's breathing. She had drifted into exhausted, fitful sleep. David envied her the brief oblivion. He had done everything possible. Every window boarded, every door barricaded. The bear trap lay in silent ambush. Their pathetic collection of sharpened tools stood ready. David had run scenarios repeatedly until his brain felt worn, building the best defense possible. Now, only waiting remained, waiting for the system to fail. The clock on the mantelpiece began to chime. The sound was soft, gentle metallic notes announcing midnight. David's head snapped up, his hand tightening on the hoe. This was it. A primal part knew this was the signal. As the 12th chime faded, another sound answered, a deeper, resonant tone, the slow, solemn tolling of the church bell. Bong! A heavy, mournful sound rolled through the valley. seeming to shake the house's foundations. David was instantly on his feet, heart hammering. Bong! The second toll. Closer, clearer. Not just sound, but a pronouncement. As the last echo died, it happened. A jarring click from the basement fuse box, then instantaneous, total blackness. The candle flame snuffed out, as if by an invisible hand. The refrigerator hum died. The world stripped of light and mechanical sound, leaving only rain drumming and the frantic, wet sound of David's own breathing in absolute dark. "David?" Sarah's voice was a sharp spike of fear. "Stay there," David commanded, voice a harsh rasp. Feeling his way to the boarded window, fingers finding the small peephole drilled earlier, he knew. It wasn't a power outage, it was timed, part of the ritual. David pressed his eye to the opening. At first, nothing but disorienting black. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them. Faint, flickering points of light emerging from the town's edges. One, another, a dozen. Torches. Moving with slow, hypnotic grace, not rushing, not charging, forming a wide, perfect circle around the property. Flames like malevolent fireflies in the suffocating dark. "What is it? What do you see?" Sarah's voice trembled. David couldn't answer. Only watch as the ring of fire slowly, methodically tightened. Dozens of them. The entire town. Not an army attacking, but a congregation worshiping. The audience. The walls of the arena. The last, fragile hope David clung to, that someone in town might dissent, incinerated in that fiery circle. They were all complicit, leaving the Millers utterly, completely alone. The hoe in David's hand suddenly felt like a child's toy, pathetic against an entire functioning system of belief. Sarah came up behind him, her hand gripping his arm, knuckles digging into his bicep, though he barely felt it. His gaze remained fixed on the fields. The circle of torches stopped, holding position, casting a hellish orange light across the harvested corn. In the center of that unholy amphitheater, at the maze's dark heart, something was wrong. The familiar slumped silhouette of Old Man Thresh against the skyline was gone. The thick wooden post stood empty, a black skeletal finger pointing skyward. A collective gasp, a soft, windy sound rose from the torchbearers, and then David saw it. A movement at the edge of the field where their lawn met the corn. A shadow detaching itself from other shadows. A tall, impossibly thin figure, moving with a jerky, disjointed gait like a tangled marionette, stepped from the corn into the flickering firelight. It was the scarecrow, but it was alive. The figure began to walk towards their house, its long, stick-like legs moving in a slow, unnatural rhythm, each step deliberate across the wet grass. David stared, mind refusing to process the image. The terror he had suppressed with logic finally broke through. Pure animal terror locking his muscles, freezing the scream in his throat. He heard a small, choked sound beside him. Sarah. Tearing his eyes from the approaching figure, David looked at his wife. Her face was a mask of utter horror, hand over her mouth, eyes wide and unblinking. That sight broke the spell. Her terror, the thought of his daughter sleeping upstairs, the protector, the father, the medic hardwired to act, finally overrode the paralyzed man. David took a deep, shuddering breath, air burning his lungs. His hand found the worn hoe handle, grip now sure and steady. He whispered a single word, not to Sarah, but to the thing now halfway across his lawn. "It's coming." Sarah scrambled back from the window, breath ragged. David didn't move. His own fear, white-hot and paralyzing, cooled, crystallizing into the sharp focus of a man with a problem to solve. His plan, his traps, the desperate work of the afternoon was all that stood between his family and the thing on the lawn. The scarecrow moved through the flickering torchlight with nightmarish grace, not shambling, but walking deliberately, the gait calculated, efficient. No footfalls sounded on the wet grass, only the dry, rasping shush, shush, shush of straw brushing straw, scraping directly against David's nerves. David stayed pressed to the peephole, his world reduced to that 1-inch circle. The hoe felt heavy, useless, a farming tool against a farmer's god. The scarecrow stopped just short of the porch, motionless for 10 full seconds. Its burlap head tilted slightly, an unnervingly analytical gesture that made the hair on David's arms stand. The creature wasn't looking at the house. It was looking at the ground, scanning, processing. A profound, chilling realization dawned. David had planned for a mindless brute, not an intelligence. Slowly, one of the creature's unnaturally long arms, a thick, gnarled oak branch, extended. The fingers, sharpened twigs, tapped the porch planks. Tap, tap, tap. Testing the surface. Then the fingers moved to the ground, tracing the perimeter of the throw rug David had carefully placed over the bear trap's rusted jaws. David held his breath, a wild, impossible hope flaring. Step on it. Just step on it. The creature did not. Instead, the longest twig finger jabbed down with sudden, brutal force into the center of the rug. The sound was a deafening, metallic crack, echoing through the silent house. The trap sprung, its iron teeth snapping shut with limb-severing force, shattering the wooden finger into splinters. The scarecrow retracted its arm without recoil or sound, simply examining the mangled branch with detached curiosity before letting it fall back. It had sacrificed a piece of itself to neutralize the threat. A wave of nausea rolled through David, his carefully laid plan dismantled, hope extinguished, leaving only cold, sick dread. The scarecrow moved again, flowing, raising one stilt-like leg, an old fence post, impossibly high, bending unnaturally. The creature stepped clear over the barbed wire tripwire David had stretched between porch railings. The movement was alien, insectile, landing on the porch with a soft, dull thud. It was at the front door. David stumbled back from the peephole, looking at Sarah crouched near the barricaded hallway, her face a pale oval in the gloom. He could only shake his head, a single, sharp gesture. It didn't work. And then the sound started. Not a crash, not splintering wood, but something far more intimate, unnerving. Scrape. A slow, dry, deliberate sound, like a sharp fingernail dragged across the plywood David had nailed over the door. Scrape. Scrape. Methodical, patient, the sound of intelligence at work. This thing wasn't a brute, it was a strategist. David's entire defensive strategy felt obsolete. The scraping stopped. For a long, terrible moment, only silence remained, broken by rain and their ragged breathing. Then came a new sound, a low, splintering creak, not from the door, but the wall to its left. Then another creak, and another. The creature wasn't trying to break the door down, it was pulling the boards off. A final, loud crunch, and splintered plywood hit the floorboards inside. A pause. Then a new sound, a dry, whispery shush, shush. Straw dragging across the living room floor. It was inside. Up, David hissed, voice raw, urgent. Now. No time for plans, only instinct. David grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her towards the stairs. He lunged into Lily's room, scooped the sleeping child in a single motion, and burst into the master bedroom at the hall's end, the furthest, most defensible point. David slammed the heavy wooden door, fumbling with the old skeleton key lock. The loud clicks seemed to broadcast their location. The closet, David breathed, eyes scanning. No windows. Sarah needed no telling. Taking Lily, the small body stirring sleepily, Sarah bundled her into the cavernous walk-in closet, smelling of cedar and her own perfume, from a life feeling centuries away. She crouched in the far corner, pulling Lily tight, her body a shield. David followed, pulling the louvered closet door shut, plunging them into near absolute darkness. And then they listened. The house fell silent again, for a minute. 2. Sarah's heartbeat roared in her ears. She gently pressed a hand over Lily's mouth, feeling her daughter's soft breath. Crack. The sound came from the staircase, the first step, old wood complaining under unimaginable weight. Crack. The second. Closer. Slower. Each step tightened the vice of terror. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, focused solely on remaining silent, feeling Lily begin to tremble. The creaking stopped. It was upstairs, in the hallway. The shushing sound returned, softer, sliding along the floor, feet away, stopping directly before their bedroom door. Sarah held her breath until her lungs burned, hearing David do the same beside her, a rigid statue. Sarah waited for the crash, the splintering door. It didn't come. Instead, a new sound began, small, intimate, 1,000 times more terrifying. Scritch. It came from the wall her back pressed against, a faint, dry scratching, like a sharp twig dragged across plaster on the other side. A jolt of pure electric horror shot through Sarah. The creature wasn't at the door, it was here. The relative safety of the closet evaporated, the threat inches away, separated only by thin lath and plaster. Sarah could feel the faint vibration through her shoulder blades. The scratching grew more insistent, methodical. Scritch, scrape, exploring. Lily let out a small, muffled whimper against her mother's hand. The scratching stopped, followed by another silence, pregnant with intent. Then came a hard, dull thump against the plaster, and another.
Thump. Sarah could hear the faint trickle of dust falling between the walls. Lily began to struggle, her small body writhing with rising panic. Sarah held her tighter, whispering a frantic, soundless, "Shh, shh, baby, it's okay," her own terror making the words a lie. Crunch. A louder sound, drywall giving way. A small, dark hole, no bigger than a fist, appeared in the closet wall just above their heads, raining dust. Through the hole, Sarah could see the flickering, hellish orange light from the torches outside. Lily gasped. Sarah clamped her hand tighter. The scratching sound returned, working at the edges of the hole, widening it. A sliver of wood, a dark, pointed, twig-like finger, poked through the opening, then retreated. David moved. In the near-total darkness, Sarah saw his silhouette shift as he raised the sharpened hoe, its blade a faint glint. The closet door, their last barrier, shuddered with a loud crack. Heavy, methodical pressure was being applied from outside. The creature wasn't trying to get through the wall anymore. It knew they were in here. It was coming through the door. The thin, louvered wood bowed inward, slats groaning, threatening to snap. Trapped, boxed in. The sanctuary had become the tomb, nowhere left to run. The scarecrow's arm, a thick branch ending in splintered twigs, punched through the ruined closet door, not violently, but methodically, exploratorily, sweeping the space inside, blind but purposeful. David acted on pure instinct, roaring, a guttural sound, and swinging the heavy garden hoe like a baseball bat. The metal blade met oak branch with a dull thunk, carving a shallow gash but failing to stop its momentum. The creature's strength was obscene. It simply pushed, and David, a man of solid build, was swatted aside like a fly, his shoulder crashing hard against the plaster wall. The hoe clattered from his numb fingers, pain shooting through his arm. David saw the thing disregard him completely, its burlap head turning with that slow, analytical tilt towards the corner where Sarah shielded Lily. Its objective had never been David. It was always, only, Lily. In that half-second of helpless clarity, as the creature began stepping through the ruined doorway, everything slowed. The world narrowed to disconnected images. Sarah's terrified face, white in the gloom. Lily's small hands clutching her mother's jacket. The dry, rustling sound of the creature's straw body. A sudden cascade of connections sparked in David's mind. Abernathy's words, part of the land. The brittle corn stubble, the flickering torchlight. Fire. The word wasn't a plan, it was an answer. Terrible, beautiful, heretical. "Get her out of here," David screamed at Sarah, voice raw, commanding. "The back door." "Go, buy me time." He didn't wait for understanding. While the creature was momentarily distracted by Sarah scrambling with Lily, David exploded into motion, shoving past the hulking form in the doorway. The rough burlap scraped his cheek, the smell of damp earth and something ancient, loamy, filling his nostrils. David didn't run. He flew, half falling down the stairs, feet barely touching treads. The living room was a chaotic obstacle course. Vaulting over the overturned sofa, his bad shoulders screaming, David ignored the pain, bursting through the kitchen towards the attached garage. His destination? A small, red plastic can tucked away, filled last week for the lawnmower, for a life now non-existent. Grabbing it, fingers fumbling with the child-proof cap, a cruel joke, David cursed, twisted it free, and scrambled for the back door.
Bursting out onto the back porch into the cold, rain-soaked night, David saw the circle of torches still burning at the edge of the property, a ring of silent, watching eyes. He saw Sarah, a frantic shadow pulling Lily across the wet lawn towards the relative darkness of the cornfields. David also saw the scarecrow. It had emerged from the bedroom, not via the stairs, but by simply stepping out of the second-story window, its long legs absorbing the drop with unnatural ease. Already on the lawn, the creature moved with that same relentless, paced rhythm toward his wife and daughter. There was no more time. David's training screamed at him to stop, but the paramedic part of him was dead. Only the father remained. Yanking the spout off the gas can, David began pouring, sloshing the gasoline in a wide, desperate arc across the dry porch planks, over dead leaves, and onto the first few rows of brittle corn stalks. The pungent, chemical smell of destruction was overwhelming. He emptied the can in seconds, tossing it aside. Sarah screamed David's name from the field's edge, her voice thin against the wind. The scarecrow was closer now, 20 feet, 15. Backing away, David's hand plunged into his pocket, fingers closing around a small metal Zippo lighter, a relic from a life supposedly quit. His thumb fumbled against the flint wheel. Spark. Nothing. Spark. Nothing. The scarecrow stood 10 feet away, its featureless face a mask of silent intent. Spark. On the third try, a small flame sputtered to life, dancing wildly, its tiny light reflected in David's wide, terrified eyes. He didn't throw it. No time remained. David simply dropped it. The world erupted. A deep "foom" swallowed all sound as a wall of incandescent orange shot up between David and the creature. A roaring curtain of fire, hotter than the sun. The heat slapped his face, singing eyebrows and hair. Staggering back, David shielded his eyes from the glare. The fire moved terrifyingly fast, leaping from porch to dry stubble, a crackling beast consuming everything, creating a barrier, a moat of destruction. David stood on one side, breathing thick, acrid smoke, lungs burning. On the other, framed by roaring flames, stood the scarecrow, motionless. It wasn't burning. David's hammering heart seized. The mistake realized too late. It wasn't afraid of fire. Part of the land, patient as stone, it just waited. The fire crawled up the house siding. The home bought for safety. Now a countdown clock, not a wall. David saw Sarah at the field's edge, face a mask of horror in the blaze. He screamed her name, voice swallowed by the roar, mouthing, "Stay back," uselessly. The path appeared sooner than imaginable. A porch section, beams eaten by flames, groaned, then collapsed inward with a crash of sparks. The firewall faltered, creating a gap, a dark corridor through the blaze. Without hesitation, the scarecrow moved, stepping through the opening. Its straw clothes smoldered, but didn't truly burn, protected by the damp, ancient earth giving it life. The creature was on their side now, the final barrier gone. It ignored David, its burlap head fixed on the two figures at the field's edge, beginning to walk towards them across the scorched lawn with that same awful, methodical pace. Time fractured for David. The fire's roar faded to a hum. The world narrowed to 3 points. Creature, wife, child. 10 yards felt like a mile. His exhausted mind stripped of strategy, left only one final imperative. David looked around wildly. The hoe, the spade, useless toys. Then his gaze fell on the outdoor fireplace, its chimney a dark monolith against the fiery backdrop. Hanging there, on 2 iron hooks, was the old scythe Sarah had bought. A decorative antique, a slice of rustic charm. Its long curved blade gleamed in the firelight. David didn't think, he acted. Scrambling to the fireplace, hands clumsy, he tore the heavy scythe from its hooks. The wooden handle felt smooth and solid, the blade's weight unexpectedly, reassuringly heavy. David didn't run to meet the creature head-on, a fool's game. Instead, he ran in a wide, desperate arc, a tactical move born of pure instinct, legs pumping, lungs screaming for air. His goal wasn't to fight it, but to get between it and his family. The scarecrow was almost to them. Sarah tried pulling Lily back, stumbling on uneven ground, while Lily screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. David's body screamed in protest, but he pushed harder, cutting across the creature's path. He saw its head turn, finally acknowledging him as an obstacle. One long, branch-like arm swung out, twig fingers aiming for his throat. David didn't try to block, instead dropping, sliding on wet grass, a move fueled by adrenaline. The arm whistled over his head. Now at the creature's feet, David knew he lacked strength to sever the thick legs, but didn't need to. He just needed to stop it, anchor it, by one more second. Roaring, a sound torn from his soul, David swung the scythe with all his remaining force, aiming low, not for the torso. The heavy, curved blade scythed through the air, biting deep into the scarecrow's wooden calf with a sickening thwack. David put his entire weight behind it, driving the blade's point through wood and deep into the soft soil beneath. The creature stumbled, its relentless motion arrested, pinned, tethered. It twisted, body contorting with unnatural, silent fury. The other arm, the one with the shattered finger, swung down towards David, who lay exposed, no time to move. He threw up an arm, a futile gesture, and then a pale, gray light bloomed on the eastern horizon. Dawn. The blow never landed. The arm froze mid-strike. David watched, breathless, as a slow, terrible transformation began. No explosion, just quiet, creeping death. The smoldering burlap hardened, fading to stony gray. Straw stiffened like wooden quills. Slow, silent petrification spread, locking its form into an obscene statue of arrested violence, arm forever raised. David lay gasping on the damp grass, air tasting of smoke and victory. He looked at Sarah and Lily, huddled safely at the field's edge. He looked at the burning ruin of their home, symbol of his failed plan for control. And he looked at the grotesque statue, pinned by his final act. David closed his eyes. The phantom siren wail, the smell of rain and gasoline, the cold feel of twisted metal, all gone. For the first time in 3 years, the ghosts were silent. He had done it. This time, David had saved the child. A hand touched his shoulder. Opening his eyes, David saw Sarah kneeling beside him, face smudged, tear tracks cutting through grime. She said nothing, just helped him up. The three stood together, small, broken, utterly whole, wrapped in the smoke of their burning past and the clean, cold light of the new day. In the distance, the villagers' torches extinguished one by one. Their ritual failed, the cycle broken. David looked at the ruin of his house. Blackened timbers, smoldering remains. He had lost everything he came here to build. But pulling his wife and daughter into a fierce, trembling embrace, David knew he had found the one thing truly needed. His gaze drifted past the smoldering ruins.
At the statue's base, where the scythe pinned the creature's leg, something happened. From the deep gash in petrified wood, a single drop of liquid, black and thick as tar, slowly welled up, trembled, and fell, absorbed instantly by the hungry soil.